This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host, Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is a fan of the scary, mysterious, and suspenseful. Samantha Skal is the co-director of Thriller Fest, the co-founder of Shadows and Secrets Writing Retreats. The 2024 version of that is in Salem, Massachusetts. And she is an author accelerator certified book coach who specializes in mystery, thriller, and suspense authors, from novel planning through the delightful hell that is revision. She writes stories that keep her up at night and lives in the Pacific Northwest. And she's here today to talk about making sure that the thrillers and mysteries that we write have twists that work. Samantha, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This is my favorite subject, so very
All
excited to
right.
be here.
Well, good. And it's actually really timely for me. I'm writing my sixth novel, which is it's about a family of hillbilly hitmen in rural Alabama.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I am nearing the halfway point, and Barb and I have talked about this before. I send the first drafts in chunks to my alpha reader,
Awesome.
and I just sent her the last batch. And the previous batch, she had said, I can tell that this is building towards something. And things were going pretty well. And so, a reader in the genre will know that things can only go well for so long before some terrible things have to happen. And those
Indeed.
terrible things have just happened. And so I've just wrote, hopefully, a twist that works.
Awesome. Yeah, it's writing twists is just, you kind of have to think through it from the villain's perspective, is how I like to approach it. And so figuring out what the people doing bad things are doing before you kind of get into the actual writing of the story can make a huge difference for figuring out whether or not it actually works on the page. But of course, there's always, trial and error, and that's what beta and alpha readers are for, and seeing how it lands.
Yeah, and that's kind of the magic of writing that I think a lot of people who are, I don't want to say just readers, I mean, who are readers but not writers don't realize is you have a lot of opportunities to fix whatever mistakes you have made along the way before it ever gets to them. And so it doesn't have to come out right the first time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's zero draft is a phrase I really love. A bunch of my book coach friends also use it, and it just sort of takes the pressure off. So whether you're a pantser or you're a plotter like me, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle actually, but I really like the idea of thinking through kind of the big aspects of the story and particularly what the villain's doing before I start writing. But of course things pop in, I'll have some idea and sometimes those end up working. And that's okay. That's part of the magic and the fun of writing.
All right, so I
Yes.
think this is really interesting that you consider it from the villain's perspective, because I think that's probably not the normal route of it. Like for me, my fifth novel was a mystery novel that I didn't know really who the villain was until I was probably halfway through. I knew
Yeah.
some, the actions that would be taken and things like that. But, it was a cast of characters and I wasn't sure who the bad guy was until I was partway through. So tell me about this process of
Mhm.
looking at it from the villain's perspective to see what actions they're prospectively going to take as this goes along.
Yeah, so I like to think of story. I know we're on a podcast, so it's kind of have to describe it, but sort of like a pyramid or like a tetrahedron or something. So you have the story in the middle, and you can look at it from the protagonist's perspective on one side, the villain's perspective on another side, maybe the best friends on this side, maybe the, police enforcement or law enforcement, whatever, from this side. But everyone's going to view the same story from a very different perspective. The villain wants to get done what they want to get done, and usually that's a bad thing because we're writing scary stories. And the protagonist typically wants to stop them, as does the law enforcement. And sometimes those two people are the same. Depends on what you're doing. But it's really important to figure out why the villain wants what they want, because that's what creates villains that don't land flat for the reader, right? Like, we've all seen, I don't want to name any names, but like we've seen some action movies where the villain's just like in their lair, and doing bad things for the sake of doing bad things. And movies are a little different, but if we don't understand why they want what they want, all of a sudden it's just like, okay, well, great, that's kind of boring. Whereas if we understand that they have a very good reason, they think, for doing what they're doing, all of a sudden that becomes much more suspenseful and much more engaging for the reader. But it's difficult to be in the villain's head. This is one of the things I've discovered over the last couple of years of coaching and writing in this space is, you have to really understand a little bit more about psychology than I originally expected and sort of get into
Mhm.
the head of somebody who might want to do these things. I am not a murderer, but to write
Yeah.
these books, you kind of have to think, what would drive someone to make these, kind of crazy decisions and extreme decisions is a better way of saying that.
And as a reader or a watcher of
Mhm.
with villains, I prefer the nuanced villain who is doing bad things, but you can see their flaw or what led to that, and
Yeah.
you're rooting for them for a redemptive arc, which you may not get. But if
Hmm.
the villain is just in their lair and all they're a sociopath and they're just doing bad things all the time, well, honestly, I find that kind of boring.
Exactly. It's not as fun, right? We love
Not
to
as
have the
fun.
humanity be a
Yeah.
part of it because honestly, that's a little scarier. And I think that people who are drawn
Mhm.
to traditional mystery, traditional thriller, we want to have somebody that we think we maybe can save.
Yes.
Speaking of your redemptive arc, that's a really good way of putting it. And, again, maybe we don't have that, but that suspense of whether or not that's going to happen is very engaging for the reader and really pulls the story along.
Yeah, I was thinking about an example of this, and I'm not really a comic book person, and I'm not really a Marvel movie person, but an
Yeah.
example came to mind from that in the Black Panther movie, the first one that
Hmm.
came out several years ago now, that the villain, who I think was Michael B. Jordan, um,
Testing my knowledge here.
yeah, yeah. Well, so he had,
Yep.
he came from a historically oppressed people, and
Hmm.
he wanted power and, might makes right kind of situation of the people who had had power before him had mistreated his people, and so he wanted to gain power so that he could turn the tables. And like, you could understand where he's coming from, and like, you get it. And there is sympathy built into that and empathy built into that, rather than I'm just going to commit atrocities because that's the thing that I do. Like, there was enough story there for you to understand where he's coming from and be like, you know what, like, I don't agree with with what you're doing, but I kind
Of
of see how
course.
you got there.
Yeah, that's such a good example. And I think Marvel does a great job with that in general. I've seen most of those movies now at this point, and the new Aquaman, I won't give away any spoilers, but they do a good job with that particular aspect of it as well. It's a really well written movie. I really liked it.
Well, so let's talk about what makes a twist work.
Yeah.
And because I think all of us can have books or movies that we think back on and like, man, I didn't see that coming, and that was amazing. And I'll tell you, one of the first movies that I
So,
really remember this about was Primal Fear. Nope, is that it? The one with Edward Norton, and he is being represented. Now I'm gonna have to look it up, but he's potentially going to jail and he's on trial. And there's a huge twist at the end,
Yeah.
and you're like, holy cow, I didn't see that coming. And now you have to look back at the entire movie and think about, should I have seen it coming? Should
Right.
any of the other characters have seen that coming? And what did I miss along the way? So what what makes a twist work or not work, whichever one of those that you want to start with.
Yeah. So I like to think of those clues when you look back from the standpoint of the end of the story, the end of the novel, the end of the movie, whatever, and you look back and you think to yourself like, oh, exactly like you just said, should I have seen that coming? What did I miss? And it's always because of misdirection. It's always because there's some other logical explanation for what has popped above the surface of the story that's actually going on with the villain. So I like to think of those clues as surface clues. So if you picture your story as like a flat plane, the villain is beneath, maybe in the basement of this, like that's the first floor is the story. And every now and again they poke a knife up through the floor. And those poke through moments are the villain's surface clues, if you will, where what they're actually doing is being exposed to the protagonist, who's the person moving through the story experiencing this. And so, if you have a hole in the floor and you're walking through a house, you might just think like, oh, there was a knot in the wood, it fell through. Or, maybe I don't know, some animal gnawed through it or something. You're not going to assume that there's someone in the basement trying to poke up through what's going on. This is a terrible metaphor, but I think you follow me. Anyway, when we look back through, those clues have to be on the page. So the protagonist has to see them, quote unquote, and acknowledge them as they're looking through what they're examining in the scene. So they might notice the hole in the floor, but they're also going to notice an open window. And they're also going to notice, like, a vial of poison on the counter or whatever it is. And that's misdirection, right? We're looking at other things that are very logical for them to pay attention to, but we have seen, quote unquote, the clue on the page. And if the reader doesn't see it as well, doesn't have the chance to examine it, it's going to feel unsatisfying at the end because we will feel like we didn't have a chance to see what was actually there. And so those clues have to be on the page to make a satisfying twist. And those kinds of twists that pop up that feel unsatisfying or unearned are because we didn't have a chance to actually solve it for ourselves. But it's like this cat and mouse game with the author and the reader, right? Like thriller authors and mystery authors know that readers are going to look at every single clue on the page and examine it and clock it and, pay attention. And it's our job as the author to think about what they're thinking about each clue and then misdirect it so that we lead them in a certain direction to create a satisfying twist.
And those mystery readers it's hard to put it out there, but cover it up a little bit and have it visible enough so that it's legit. So people don't say, oh no, you just had somebody pop up and mouth, the platitude and explanation that you could never have gotten. But these people are crossword puzzle doers. They do them in think, they are brainiacs. So it is hard to really provide enough, but hide it enough. It's a tough thing. When you do it, do you have beta readers that go through and read it specifically for that purpose? How do you edit for that?
Absolutely. So, when I finish a draft, I read it through and I make sure that all the clues that I want for the twist to actually work are on the page. And then I read through and I make sure that I think that they're hidden enough. And sometimes people will get it. This is exactly what beta readers are for. And so when I send it out to a beta reader, I don't ask them, what did you think? Or, did you like it? Because if they are my friend, they're going to tell me they love it. And I don't want that. I want them to tell the truth. And so I ask specific questions. So when did you figure out who did it? Give me the page number. When were you confused? Give me the page number. When were you bored? Give me the page number. And in that way, I can look back and see what might have happened on that page to make it be, so obvious. And so that's a great way to be able to tell, if somebody's getting it on page 80 instead of page 280, look back and see what happened on page 80 or just before that and see what might be there that you can take out.
That
Do you
is
provide
so.
Yeah, do you provide that questionnaire ahead of time so they know going in these
Oh
are
yeah, no,
yeah.
I tell them, yes, I'd love to hear that you loved it. I'm a human. I love getting praise. It's my love language. Tell me I'm doing a good job. But
Yeah.
also I really need to know if this is working. And, if there's too many clues, then what can I back off of? What can can I add a subplot that makes a lot more sense for what the clues might represent? Because what makes, a twist, my definition of a twist is that it is the reveal of the villain's truth. And so these surface clues that are popping up, twists are just the villain's story being actually told, right? So what the villain is actually doing is being revealed at a certain time that the author has very cleverly, hopefully, masked up until that point, and they are satisfying because they're unexpected to the protagonist and therefore the reader. But to write them, you have to know what's going on with the villain before you can even get in there.
When you're
How many
writing, so
clues?
I have a framework that I go
Yeah.
by that I've adopted from Sean Coyne, who is the creator of Story Grid.
Yeah, it's
And
amazing.
each section of the book is divided into, like Act One, and then Act Two is split into two parts, and then there's Act Three. And each has things that need to happen depending on genre within those. So I have kind of a framework that I go by that if you read all of my books, there is going to be a commonality about what point in the story certain things happen.
Yeah.
Do you have a go by or anything like that you use when you're storytelling to make sure that things are happening in a certain order so that it's satisfactory later on?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of the if you're writing a traditional mystery, you kind of need a body on the first page. That's the expectation for the genre. And of course, there are ways that work that are different than that. But the sooner you can get that inciting incident, that major crime, whatever it is, at the beginning, the more satisfying the reader is going to be, the more engaged they're going to be. The 50% midpoint turn is a twist, but it's more about like the fake villain than the real villain, right? So the 50% is where the story takes a hard left or a hard right. It's the point of no return. It's the point where it's like, okay, we're going for the climax now. We can't turn back. Something has fundamentally changed, and I can't go back to where I was in my life before this story started, says the protagonist. And then from 50 to about 82 to 87, somewhere in there, that's like the ramp up with the high suspense toward the climactic scene. And the climactic twist can either be the reveal of the real villain, or it can be the face off with the fake villain that solves the story question. So, for example, if we have someone who's like pulling the strings for somebody else or framing somebody else, you might have the story question be answered about who committed this terrible thing and have that be the climactic scene, but then there's going to be some question at the end about who's actually behind it all. And that leads you beautifully into the final twist, which is at 97, 98% in the book. And that's, everything has been resolved for now. Chaos has been brought to order for now. And that's the reveal of who might be this like mastermind villain behind the scenes. And I'm a big fan of that story structure. I think it works really, really well. Taylor Adams is a thriller author who does this just like masterclass level. And I can't remember the name of his most recent book, so I will have to give that to you all for the show notes. But there is a book that came out a couple years ago that he wrote that just like, if you want to look at a structure that does this extremely well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So knowing that there are structures and they work, but also we need to keep things fresh, and because readers know what to expect. And so sometimes we need to subvert those expectations or just present them in a way that they haven't seen before or haven't considered. What are some things you do to make sure that your storytelling that's, you know, built on the backs of the way successful stories are told
Yeah.
are fresh and new for readers?
Um,
Mhm.
that's a great question. I would say think about what your reader is expecting and then subvert that. So Riley Sager did this really well in the House Across the Lake. It came out, kind of at the tail end of all those books about drunk woman looking at her neighbors and making all kinds of assumptions about what's happening. And he leaned into that very hard so that you thought that was the kind of book that you were reading. The title led into it. We have a drunk woman in the first scene when she's looking at her neighbor. And then it does so much more. And it's not even at all what you expected. And that was one of my favorite things about that book, is that he played with my expectations of the genre, the subgenre, drunk woman
Mhm.
looking at the neighbor, and then changed it. And that becomes unexpected and twisty because he knew what the reader was going to be thinking. And so we can all do this. If you have a, I don't know, run-of-the-mill serial killer offing people, think about motivations, think about, what if somebody is forcing them to do this? What if, just asking what if, and thinking about particularly what the reader is thinking when they come in, when they read the book jacket copy. The manipulation starts with the cover.
Mhm.
It's we're leading people in a certain direction and then subverting those expectations to make the twist.
So
Do do
go ahead,
you
Barb.
know the number of clues? Do you know the substance of the clues before you start writing? And do you have a number that you like to have in your books?
Oh, good question. No, I don't get quite that granular with it. It
Yeah.
sort of is one of those things where this is where betas come in, right? Like if it's working, it's working. I've
Yeah.
definitely read books where when I looked back, I was like, oh my God, I should have gotten that. It was all over the place, and I've read books where
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, there were two clues and I didn't see them because they were just kind of glossed over. Again, just, we saw this over here and we were meant to be looking at this thing over here because it was way shinier. Um, and so it depends so heavily on the story and, how it's delivered and how suspicious your protagonist is, like a suspicious protagonist or someone who's very sort of negative on everything is going to need fewer clues because they're suspicious of everything, right? And so there's lots of little subplots that you can play with and lots of assumptions, lots of interiority about, oh, I'm walking through the woods right now and I'm definitely going to get murdered because that's what happens in the woods, right? And of course, it's just a nice walk in the woods, but you've created suspense with that. You've created, the reader is like on the edge of their seat wondering what's going to happen, and then nothing happens. But actually there was someone in the woods.
So I'm going to spoil the end of the series Justified and Ozark real quick. Have Unless I need not to do that for either of you.
I am fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go for it.
So if you haven't watched those, just you probably need to skip a few minutes here. In both of those shows, which weren't mysteries, but they had suspense thriller elements to them, the way they wrapped up. So with Ozark, you have Ruth, who is, from the Ozarks. She's from there. At the very end, she gets killed, and the rich white folks get away with stuff. And you're like, okay, that probably, and I left thinking that's probably how that situation turns out. It's Jason Bateman and Laura Linney get away with everything because they are who they are, and then the poor, I will use this word because white trash, like, she dies. And that seems like that's probably how that thing goes in the end. But I didn't find it satisfying. And maybe that's just because I was so attached to Ruth, and that's not how I wanted that to end. And then in Justified, you had the end of Justified with Raylan Givens. He's seeing his kid who he's not raising, but like the kid has her mom and stepdad, and he's reunited with her. And Boyd Crowder is in prison where you expect him to be. But at the end of that one too, I was like, okay, like that checks out. And that's probably how that turns out. But it wasn't the ending that I wanted. And I kind of wanted, like, Raylan and Boyd are riding off into the sunset because they both decided to be criminals, or they're both dead. Like, I wanted a different resolution. And both of those had plausible endings, but for me, they weren't satisfying endings. So I'm not even sure what.
Particularly Justified, because Raylan was a hero, and at the end, he's a housewife. And I'm not putting down housewives, but it's like, okay, I don't really see this. Like, what happened to you, Raylan?
Yeah, so I guess, are there things that we should consider so that we don't get to the end of our book and we have an ending that's plausible, but it's just not gripping, compelling, or satisfying enough?
Yeah. Oh, what a good question. No one's ever asked me this before. So I would think what I tell people to do is, if you're in the plotting kind of ideation phase, whether, I don't like to plot where I have like a 70-page outline. I like to plot where I have a 3-page outline, which for your listeners, Jenny Nash's Blueprint for a Book, highly, highly, highly recommend in terms of if you want something to guide you through creating a high-level outline. She's amazing. Her advice is wonderful, and I live by it for my own writing. But when I am in the ideation phase and I kind of figure out, okay, I think, this person might be the villain. And going back to what you said earlier about not knowing who the villain is, that happens to me all the time. I think someone's going to be the villain when I first start kind of ideating. And then I go through and I'm like, oh, but this person is really fun. And, what if they were the person doing all this stuff? Or what if they're the person behind the scenes? Or, just asking that what if. That gets to the very end as well. If you're in the kind of space where you're wondering how it ends, come up with 10 endings. 8 of them are going to be not functional, and potentially you're going to have to rewrite the entire thing to fit that ending. But maybe one of them will be something that you didn't expect and also is very satisfying. And I think this is where the final twist, kind of thought process can come in and be really helpful, is that the forcing yourself, not forcing, but trying very, very hard to have a final twist in your story can really help with that ultimately satisfying feeling that you want your reader to have. And so with the examples you just gave where you were not satisfied with how it ended because you were rooting for these characters, you wanted them to succeed, that's really tough. And I think in TV particularly, you're dealing with, so many different populations of people who are going to want a certain thing, and you can't please everybody. And so probably they thought this was the best version for satisfying the most people. But with novels, it's typically a lesser reach than a TV show. And so write the kind of story that you want to read, end it how you would like it to end. And I don't know, I write books that I want to read. I write scary stuff where women are strong and, ultimately have some emotional realization that helps them conquer the evil in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you consider, when you're in the drafting phase, do you consider at all the reader experience?
Oof. It kind of depends on the day, if I'm being totally honest. So when you have to, to write a book, we all know this, you have to hold the author viewpoint in your head. You have to hold the protagonist viewpoint in your head. You have to hold what the villain's doing. You have to hold what the reader's doing. You have to hold, the entire plot in your head to make sure that what you have on the page is actually what matches your vision. And so this is where revision comes in, right? You do several rounds. I do like to put it down after I do a draft. Sometimes if I get drafting, I'll just go for it. I'll have, my scene goals and know what I'm doing, and it'll just kind of flow out, and I don't worry about it. I just write it. That's the zero draft. And then I'll go back through after putting it down for a couple weeks or even a month and look back and see if I can read it from a reader perspective and see how it feels. Am I bored at any point? Is this just so glaringly obvious of a clue? But that's really tough because as authors, we know what we've put in to manipulate the reader and what clues we put on the page. And it's very difficult to unsee those once they're out there, which again is why other pairs of eyeballs are just the most important thing in the revision process. Yeah.
And you may have just answered this, but one of the things that a blind spot that I have is making sure that what's in my head is actually on the page.
Yes, we all have that. That's normal.
Yeah. And it may be that beta readers are the answer to this, but what measures do you have in place to make sure that you've actually communicated and, gone through your fingers and into the keyboard onto the page all the things that are in your head?
Yeah, so that's where the outlining comes in. So when I do a thriller or a mystery, I write both. I have what's happening on the page, and then I have a sub bullet in my outline that's what's actually going on. And that typically is an entirely different story, right? Thinking of the story from the villain's perspective. So the villain is over here trying to make the protagonist not do this or whatever. You can also think of thrillers as like, that's the villain's story, but the protagonist came in and ruined everything because they're trying to stop them. And so those bullets really help me in terms of, what have I forgotten? And so if I have a clue that I definitely need to be at a certain point in the story so I can create the satisfying twist 50, 70, 100 pages later, I have a note to myself about that. Doesn't always work. This is where betas can really be a huge help. And this is why betas are so precious, particularly with mysteries and thrillers, because they can only read or draft once before they know who the villain is, right? So one at a time and ask them these questions. But yeah, it's hard. We all have blind spots where we know what we want to say, and sometimes it just doesn't end up on the page. Like I have an ongoing critique group that is this is what we do is we send 10 pages to each other every month, and it can be whatever. And we send it to them blind, and then we see how it was received. And, they'll constantly ask me questions like, well, did you mean to say this? Like, this is what I'm thinking about this. And I'm like, no, not at all. Like, I wanted it to be this. And then that's a chance for reader clarity.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I don't think I've thought of it in particularly this way before, but I think I really like the sub bullet idea, because so much of what is happening in a scene is, and I don't even know if I can word this in the way that I'm trying to, because I'm just now thinking about it. You have particularly things you need to accomplish in a scene because of how they affect the story. But, man, I'm going to do a really poor job of communicating this. But so much of what is happening with the overall story is not concretely happening within that scene, but they're connected to each other.
That's really very well said. Yeah, exactly. I mean, every
And
single thing that anyone notices in a thriller or a mystery, anything the protagonist or POV characters, if you have multiple POVs, every single thing they clock is going to show up as a clue to the reader. And so we
Mhm.
don't want them to, forcing them to remember too much. So we want to strike that balance between hanging questions that we use as authors to kind of get people to flip a page, and then also things that they might figure out sooner rather than later. So we force the reader to think about what we want them to think about, which is probably not the actual thing we want them to think about. It's
Yeah.
complicated. This is what many passes are for.
Yeah, it is. And, word choice is so important too, because one of my beta readers in my fifth novel, we were talking about it afterwards, and she was like, I never saw coming what happened, but in part because something you said in, like, the first third of the book caused me to think it was supernatural.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. It was just regular old natural terrible people stuff happening. And so
Yeah.
I went back and looked, and it was just one simile that I
So
used,
interesting.
particular language about, that she thought a shadow was something supernatural, and I didn't intend it that way at all, but it really
Yeah.
colored how she saw the rest of the book and what she expected to be unveiled. And if I hadn't had her reading it, because nobody else saw it that way, but as far as people who read it early, but somebody else was going to be thrown off by it. And if I hadn't had her reading it, then I would have left that language there, and it would have messed somebody up for their entire experience of the book. And so, yeah, like you said, the people who read it early and provide feedback, and particularly what's uninteresting or confusing, is priceless.
It is. It's just, I mean, the chance for, I mean, I've gotten better at this as I've written more. I've been a lifelong writer and reader. We probably all have, right? That's why we do this work. We love writing. But I hope that I used to be able to take feedback better. I don't remember, I'm in my 40s. I've been doing this a long time. But now I know that when someone tells me, oh, I didn't get this, or I didn't understand this at all, I don't take it personally. It's more just like, oh, okay, tell
Mm-hmm.
me more. How can I make this more clear for you so that my vision ends up on the page in the way that I want you, the reader, to receive it? And when you kind of take a step back from that, if you are feeling, not either of you, but anyone out there feeling a little bit sensitive about getting feedback like that, it's not about you. It is about your vision and it being on the page in the way that you want it to be. And so it's always a chance for reader clarity.
Yeah, and I think we've probably talked about this at some point, but one of the perspectives that I have developed is that, when there is feedback, even if it is critical feedback, it is not a criticism of you, the person, or your value as a person, or your worth. It might be a criticism of a thing you created, but you have to create a level of detachment from that. And so
Yeah.
when I hear people talk about, you know, it's my baby or whatever that took years, and like, okay, like, I get it. We're all a little bit sentimental about it, but at the same time, if you want it to be a thing that people enjoy
Mhm.
reading and you want to put it out in the world, you have to be able to detach yourself from it and tear the thing apart and reconstruct it over and over and over again, so that it provides the best experience for the reader. And once you decide to put it out there for other people to consume, you're not in charge of how they receive it. You have no
No.
control over that. And you have to just, like, I've done my thing and now it's
Yeah,
out there. And so, yeah, you just got to let it go.
you do. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's just it's hard, but it's also just this is why we always want to write the very best book we can and the book that we love the most, right? Like by the time it actually gets out there, if you are whatever publishing path you're choosing, you know, ending up with something that fits your vision as closely as possible. And to your point, everybody has filters. I can't control what some person who is reading this 5 years from now is going to think. I'm just going to do my best and hope that the people who pick it up love it as much as I do, and that I scare some people ultimately.
All right. So if people want to read your work and hopefully be scared by it, tell us where they can find it. And if I know you're co-director of Thriller Fest, so if there's anything else you need to mention along the way, be sure to do that.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I actually don't have anything out yet. I am working on it. Like everybody else, I'm on the publishing journey. And so it's great fun, and it's a journey.
Yes.
Um, and so there's nothing out yet, but if you want to follow me and find out if and when, I won't say if, when things
Yes.
come out, I'm on Instagram at author Samantha Skal, and my website is samanthaskal.com, Skal. And if you have any interest in conferences whatsoever, obviously I'm biased, but Thriller Fest is my very favorite conference. I go every single year. And not just because I'm a part of planning it now, but it's just, there's something about crime writers that I like to say that we sort of work our stuff out on the page. And so we're very friendly and very inclusive. And we're just a great group of people, and conferences of all kinds are wonderful for creating your writing community. And, writers are a weird bunch. And so we need to find our fellow weirds and
That's
our fellow
right.
nerds and join forces. So
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
thank
It's been
you.
great. Really
Really
great.
lovely to talk to you both. Yeah, thank you.